San Rocco staff and
yes.
all, and I'm sort of fairly close to those people. We've just finished a competition with Office, and so we kind of have, it's a kind of regular argument.
Okay.
I don't use the word. I find it.
Yeah, I noticed that. That's why I wanted to ask.
I don't like the word, and I don't really like program either.
Okay,
and
you don't like poetics, and I don't know what words to use.
I kind of prefer, I suppose I prefer a slightly more direct, less monumental words. And I think that, because when you say typology, suddenly there is a kind of disciplinary library that comes up into the back of your mind, and it's quite heavy, right? And I can't remember who it was. It was a friend of mine, actually, a guy called Nick Lobo Brennan, who said, programs die, buildings don't. And it's very true. And that is quite Rossi-esque. And that's quite Rossi-esque in the idea that the architecture of the city has a kind of a character over and beyond its program. That like the theatre can become a town hall, and the town hall can become a library, and the palazzo can become a hospital, and it doesn't invalidate the architectures. And maybe that also, because a lot of our projects started either in or extending existing buildings, their typology was sort of obsolete by the time we were dealing with them, even though they had the scale and maybe also the regulatory conditions of one type. And just to give you an anecdote, it's close to your friend's issue, when we were turning Raven Row into an art space, the building regulations came in and said, it's a museum. Right? That's typologically, it's a museum. So you have to have 7 kilonewtons per square meter on these floors in the old buildings. And the engineer said, I think you can get 1.5 kilonewtons per square meter on these floors. He said, you're going to have to reinforce the floors. And he says, no, you can't reinforce the floors. These are mid-18th century, grade 1 listed floors with like all the original structure, and underneath there is a plaster ceiling that's carved by hand in situ. You cannot do it. And the guy's like, yeah. And then he said, look, it's been here for 250 years. It's gone through hell and back. It's burnt down. Parts have burnt. So he said, nothing's going to happen. It's just two people looking at an artwork. Get over it. And he won the argument in the end. And in the end, I would say that it's up to regulation to catch up with how contemporary buildings are used and changed, and to adopt a much more, kind of common sense and approach to it. It's a very modernist way of looking at things, that, it's a museum, it's 7 kilonewtons per square meter, it's an office, it's 5 kilonewtons, it's a house, it's 2.5, all of those things. And to some extent the world doesn't operate like that, because essentially we're all walking around with a laptop. And so the loadings and the regulatory, I think the structural regulation is becoming less and less important. I guess that the thing that is going to become central to this topic is energy, and how buildings consume energy in their making, in their use, and then in their demolition. And that will, I think, change everything about how we think about typology and program. Just a thought.
No, actually, at the Berlage I did I started this research there, but then I continued, I still continue that. It's up on Banya typology. It's like a typology. It's like a bathhouse, like traditional Russian one, and it went through a lot of changes. I mean, it was always like primitive hut sort of thing, and then it became like when Peter the Great he put this fashion that the Banyans should come into the cities, and they started to be differentiated by hierarchies. Like, for example, there are 3 levels or 5 levels for 5 hierarchies. So, and then the place is more intimate, as more expensive it gets. And then in Soviet times, these hygiene palaces that became. So it's like, I mean, and now in the 90s they became like small saunas with a lot of commercial functions, like with, I don't know, stripping poles and billiards inside and whatever. So it became very Asian in that sense. Like Koreans have this the bank culture where they have everything in the rooms. So very like interior entertaining space. And so basically they never had the architectural typology, and it was always a program. And I could not really, like I collected it, but I can hardly even call it a typology because spatially it doesn't have a...
I mean, yeah, it's tricky, and I know that it's slightly annoying not to use the word typology, like avoiding the thing. But to some extent, I'm much more interested in, for example, in use.
In what?
Use.
Ah.
Because use is everything all the time. It's always going on, and sometimes it fits, and sometimes it doesn't. You know, I just think that somehow typology, to me, comes too loaded with theory and certain kind of rhetorical positions, which I just find. I get it, but I don't necessarily use it.
I understand. Well, besides typology, is more like expert knowledge, and use is like neutral one, so it's a good word.
Sorry.
No, that's great. I mean, I think what to do with Banya, and I like genre as a word that Duran used for such cases. So
yeah, genre is somehow nicer, and it makes me think of film and.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have the education question because yes, of course, I saw like your Glasgow Atlas and some other works, and I mean it's amazing like the amount of line drawings they produce and models and everything. But I wanted to ask you about text. Well, specifically also because I teach like the project, and I also teach a dissertation course here. And then when I read their essays, and then when some of them I know what, like where the project goes, I see like how this also synthetic process is going on between the text and project. And I just was wondering if you have text also as a tool, maybe like within the research, like do you give some certain exercises that would evoke something?
I don't give it exercise. I certainly do. We have I have a kind of reading list that's for each project, each theme. Some of them are always the same ones. There's a few kind of key texts. Then some of them are specific. And of course, in my own background, quite a strong literary background. I wrote my dissertation on the writing of Georges Perec in the 90s, when it was new, not before it was translated. And then it was all about the treatment of space in language and stuff like that. And that was an important part, and it's continued. I hand out these texts as kind of reading materials, but I don't set writing themes, mainly because I think it's not fair to set a writing theme to a group of students who are all operating in a foreign language.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I don't mean on the readings, but rather like in the projects. Like, do they write like when they need to develop statements? It's only discussion.
No, sometimes I ask them to write like small statements just to be like kind of concise when they present, but not. It doesn't have a kind of literary content the way that, let's say, when I used to teach in the UK, I would, because then I was more confident that it's reasonable to expect someone to penetrate a kind of a literary and structural quality to the writing. I think it's not fair to do that for people who are already impressive and working in a foreign language, and then to sort of expect them to kind of get into a very high literary thing. And as you say, they're busy enough doing all these crazy drawings. And but like there are a few, like Levi-Strauss's The Science of the Concrete is always a go-to. Bang, you should always go back to it. It's still the best one on the subject. There are certain texts by Perec, which I like a lot. More recently, maybe Timothy Morton, and generally things on kind of the environment, kind of quite a sort of good critical eco-lit. What else? going on in our readers at the moment.